Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. George Sparks, and this is Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down, sponsored by Bible Interact. Today I have Dr. David Graves, PhD from Aberdeen University in Scotland. He is also a retired assistant professor from Liberty University. We have a number of different topics today, which I think is going to be absolutely fascinating, dealing with the early flood epics. One is going to be called the Enuma Elish. The other one is, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which many people are aware of. There are several other tablets that he'd like to talk about if we have time.
Unveiling the Mesopotamian creation and flood epics, a journey into ancient mythology. In this video, we will embark on a journey through time to explore four remarkable epics: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Ziusudra epic, or what is sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and the Enuma Elish. The first epic is the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, which takes us on an epic adventure with the legendary king Gilgamesh. In the year 1853, two British archaeologists, Hormuzd Rassam and Henry Layard, made a groundbreaking discovery in the ancient city of Nineveh, Iraq. They stumbled upon a collection of 21 tablets, written in an ancient script known as Akkadian cuneiform. These tablets contain the epic tale of one of the earliest known works of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are many copies of these tablets stored displayed in Israel, the British Museum, Iraq Museum, in New York, and the Berlin Museum. This epic explores themes of creation, mortality, friendship, and the quest for immortality. It also contains a significant flood narrative, paralleling other flood stories from different cultures and the account found in Genesis. Many have noticed similarities between the Babylonian account of the Great Flood and the biblical account found in the book of Genesis. While both stories share some similarities, there are also significant differences that reveal the stark contrast between the two cultures. While both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical account share some similarities in the story of a great flood, the differences between them reveal the distinct cultural and religious beliefs of the Babylonians and the Hebrews. The next epic is the Ziusudra epic, sometimes called the Eridu Genesis. This epic recounts the creation of the world and the gods' decision to send a catastrophic flood to cleanse humanity. It is one of the oldest recorded stories in human history that tells the story of a man named Ziusudra who survived a great flood that wiped out humanity. The third epic we will discuss is the Atrahasis epic that presents a complex narrative of creation, gods, and humanity's struggle for survival. There are at least 5 tablets preserved in American museums, and 5 tablets in the British Museum. It tells the story of Atrahasis, a wise and resourceful hero who is warned by the gods about an impending flood. Atrahasis builds an ark to save himself, his family, and various animals, thus ensuring the continuity of life. The fourth tablet we will discuss is the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish, often referred to as the Babylonian creation myth, recounts the birth of the universe and the rise of the gods. It tells the tale of Marduk, the chief god, who battles against the primordial goddess Tiamat and her monstrous allies. This clay tablet, known as the Enuma Elish, would change our understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture forever. It is believed to have been written in the 7th century BC and is one of the oldest surviving texts in the world. These narratives, filled with gods, heroes, and cataclysmic events, have influenced subsequent mythologies and continue to resonate with us today. The discovery of these Mesopotamian creation and flood epics has not only shed light on the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, but also on the universal themes and timeless messages that continue to resonate with us today. More information with footnotes on these amazing tablets can be found in the book The Archaeology of the Old Testament by Dr. David Graves. All our books are listed on our website smyrnaean.blogspot.com and available on amazon.com.
Dr. David Graves, thank you for coming to the program once again, and this is going to be fascinating.
Great, George. Great to be with you. Yes, we have a number of the tablets that speak of the creation, even the Garden of Eden, and the flood epics. And they usually combine these stories together from the ancient Near East. Probably the most famous of all of them is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It speaks of the Garden of Eden and the flood epics, but the names are, of course, all different, and many of the facts and similarities can be compared and contrasted, and there's a lot of controversy over this among scholars. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh is an Akkadian cuneiform clay tablet It was discovered by Henry Layard and one of his crew members called Humaz Rassam. Is known from about 21 different tablets. So it's not just a single tablet. There's many of them. The copies of the story have also been discovered at Megiddo in Israel, at Imar up in Syria, and Bukaskoy up in Turkey. So this story was copied and sent out far and wide all around the ancient Near East, not just in Babylon. So it was a well-known story that everybody knew about. They translated it on other copies and they disseminated it throughout their different regions.
What does Enuma Elish mean?
The Enuma Elish is actually another copy of it found in a different area. So Enuma Elish is the first two words found in the text. The same thing as we have in the Bible, where we call it Genesis, in the beginning. So traditionally, in ancient documents, they would take the first words of the document, and that became the title for it. We'll talk about the Enuma Elish in a few moments. The Epic of Gilgamesh, however, Gilgamesh was one of the rulers of that region, and this is the epic that he has put together. It consists of about 21 tablets. George Smith in 1872 translated it. And so we have a translation of it, but there are, as I mentioned, many different copies of it, tablets that we have in different museums around the world. We have one in the British Museum. There's one in the Iraqi Museum. Actually, there's a couple there. We have the Megiddo in the Israeli Museum, one in Hattusa, Turkey, in the Turkish Museum, and that one's found in Berlin. So you can go to different museums around the world and see a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the most famous one is found in the British Museum. Now, it talks about the Garden of Eden. It's from the 7th century BC, this particular copy. It talks about Enkidu and Shamhat, and this is the equivalent of what we would call Adam and Eve. A man is created from the soil by a god, lives in a natural setting among the animals. Man is tempted by a woman. Man accepts food from the woman, covers her nakedness, and then she's forced to leave the garden, unable to return. The snake steals a plant of immortality from the hero in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So you can see the similarities in the story with the story that we read in Genesis about Adam and Eve. With the flood epic section of the story, we have the releasing of a dove, of a swallow, and of a raven. I won't go into all the details of the story itself, but I do want to point out a few similarities and a few differences because those are quite important. The question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the Epic of Gilgamesh or the biblical account? And there's generally two responses by Christians. One is that the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the same thing, the same story. But then others suggest that it was written prior to the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the dates would say that the Epic of Gilgamesh was written before probably the biblical account. My argument is that they both have a common source in the original creation, and they are writing them in accordance to their own gods, their own culture, and their own setting. So the similarities we have between the two accounts, the biblical and the ancient Near Eastern, is the flood is a divine punishment for man's wickedness. The ark is used in both accounts, but of different dimensions. So the dimensions in the Epic of Gilgamesh, I believe they're cubical. So it's like a square boat or a round boat. The collection of the animals differs as well, but the numbers differ. They have different numbers of animals they collect. Now, something that a lot of people probably do not realize is that you have in the biblical account of the flood, the animals are collected, everybody says, 2 by 2. But actually, the unclean animals were collected 7 by 7 because they had to eat. the clean animals. That's my mistake. So 2 by 2 are the unclean, and the clean animals that they could eat were 7 by 7. And if you go back and read the biblical account closely, you'll recognize that. They also will use them for sacrifice. Another similarity between the two accounts is that it rains in both accounts, but from different sources. One coming up from the ground and the other from the air. It rains in both accounts. The birds are set out from after the flood, but the order is different. Both accounts erect an altar following the flood, so that's a similarity. And both accounts agree that the human race will not be destroyed by a flood, so they will be preserved in the future. Now, what about the differences? The differences between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical account is that one is polytheistic, many gods, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the other one is monotheistic, Yahweh, one God, or Elohim. They have different names of the heroes, Gilgamesh in one, and of course, Yahweh in the other, or in the case of the biblical account, Noah as the captain of the ship. The different dimensions of the boat, as I had already mentioned, different reasons for the flood. One was because they were disturbing the gods and waking them up in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the biblical account, of course, is because of the sin of the people. Different descriptions, the slaughter of animals and the storing of the gold and silver we have in Gilgamesh, and different lengths of the flood. Gilgamesh talks about 14 days versus 371 days in the biblical account, which is a year and 17 days. So a contrast between the two accounts. So they interpreted it differently according to their own culture, their own gods, their own cultural context, but they were no doubt representing the common understanding and knowledge that there was a flood and that there was a creation in their own cultures. So my conclusion is that while the two accounts differ, the fact that there's an account of a biblical flood or of a flood at all in the Babylonian culture supports the evidence of a biblical account of a flood. The Bible talks about it, and the ancient Near Eastern people talk about it. So there's no doubt in my mind that there was a flood that they all described in similar terms, but in terms of their own gods and goddesses.
Well, I'm sure that our listening audience, that'd probably be one of their biggest questions was, like you started off,
Yep.
which came first, the chicken or the egg? And for our listening audience, and not getting way academic, did a nice job of just saying that it came from a similar source, but in their cultures, they're identifying it with their deities and their gods as devotees.
And as a Christian, I would say that certainly God had inspired the original authors of the Old Testament to write it down correctly.
Once again, for the audience, what would cause the sin that made the God of the Hebrew Bible, or our Bible, if you will, so angry to destroy the world except for Noah and the animals, of course, his family? Early on, it talks about how the sons of God had relations with the beautiful women of the world and created the Nephilim. I know we're going to hear about that. We can't get into it, but I just want to say that we're aware of that this was about the text, and but it's all very fascinating.
Yeah, that gets us off into the realm of theology, and we're dealing with archaeology, so we'll stay away from that one for the moment. I could do a whole podcast.
We're going to dig a hole and fall into it.
Yeah, I could do a whole podcast just on the theology of the Exodus and of the flood and of creation, and that's a whole other ball of wax. But getting back to the archaeology and what we know from the ancient Near East, we have the Atrahasis epic That's another creation and flood epic that's recorded according to the details found in the similar culture, but using different names and different details. And it's an important one to look at as well. It's in the British Museum, the Atrahasis epic, clay tablet number 1. It was discovered by Henry Layard and translated by Henry Smith. And also it was acquired by a guy by the name of Sir Ernest Budge. Its copies discovered at Nineveh, Ashur, Nippur, and Uruk. And these are in the region of modern-day Iraq. They were excavating there in the 1800s, 1876. 1899 is when it was acquired by the British Museum. A copy of it is actually found in Cornell University, and another one found in Berlin, and another one found in Istanbul in Turkey. So again, there are many copies of this, tablets they have in other museums. There's some 13 tablets and fragments preserved in at least 4 different recessions. There are 8 Old Babylonian versions, Middle Babylonian version, and Neo-Babylonian versions. So it's not just one copy or one version we have. So we know of this from many different tablets. The story then was well known in Mesopotamia and beyond in the 2nd millennium BC. And I would argue that God just simply said to Moses, this is what I did, and I'm going to straighten everybody out, and this is the account. And it all comes from a single source, that is the creation itself and the flood itself, which has been passed down traditionally from generation to generation. There's 2 fragments in the Berlin Museum, which is kind of interesting. So we have a number of copies of it. I'll also show some photographs of the different copies. The U.S. Museum has 5 copies of the tablets. And they're in the New York Museum, Morgan Library. Cornell University has a number of them. So I'll show some photographs of those as well, because everybody just thinks that there's a single copy of all this stuff, but there's many of them.
Let me say one other thing is that when you're talking about these a tablet, it's not necessarily just a tablet. It could be a number of tablets that they translated and assembled together. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what they do. They take the different copies that they have, recessions that they have, they compile them all together, they compare the stories and the translation, we would call it, I guess, today, because these were translated into different kinds of ancient Near Eastern language, the Akkadian, Ugaritic, and they would also have a cuneiform script that they would use to do that. So only 1/5 of it has been known since 1965, but they have found other copies, and so about 4/5 of the myth or the epic is available today. It's probably the most important creation epic of the ancient Near East outside of the Bible, the Atrahasis epic, and yet we always seem to gravitate to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this one was written before the time of Moses, about 1646 to 1626 BC is when this one was written down. And of course, some say that Moses borrowed from it, but that's of course debatable. The story was copied and recopied over the centuries, so the 3 chapters of the Epic of the Atrahasis epic were each written on their own tablets, and a full set of them have survived. And so we have 2 different versions of it. We have 2 written by the Assyrian scribes, one in Assyrian and one in Babylonian dialect. A third one on a third tablet was written during the reign of King Ammi-Sidik of Babylon, 1647 to 1626. And then parts are quoted in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So again, we know that this stuff was copied from culture to culture, tablet to tablet, shows us that as it's translated. And there are other influences are in the Babylonian history of Barusus and, of course, of the Bible. So putting it all together, we certainly know there was a creation, there was a flood, and there was a Garden of Eden.
And these other cultures are telling the same epic in their own way.
Yes, according to their cultures, their context. People get caught up in who copied who. They miss the singular point that they're copying an original tradition, or not tradition, an original event of creation, of the Garden of Eden, and of the flood that we know God has given to Moses by inspiration. But there's no doubt that this is the understanding of the ancient people who lived at that time period.
In the biblical narrative, it talks about how the patriarchs originally migrated from Mesopotamia. With them, they had their cultural epics that they could have brought with them. Doesn't the Bible actually state early on that it wouldn't be Abraham, it'd be Abram, but his families were, you can say his father, and it mentions them worshiping many deities from Mesopotamia. Why not bring that with you? I think in a way, at the very least, and this is my opinion, that in the biblical narrative, by speaking about the similarities within these cultural stories from Mesopotamia through evidence of the text, the cuneiform text, they themselves bear evidence to the early heritage, because the location where the patriarchs started. If I could take something from the homeland, let's say in archaeology, let's say it was pottery. I'm off subject a little bit, but I have pottery that I'm used to making in the homeland, from Greece, Anatolia, that area. And I bring that with me to when I migrate into the land of Canaan, and I start making pottery from that clay, but that clay from Canaan. But in my mind, I'm still making the design of the pottery from the homeland. We call that imitation made locally. And also through, let's call this the literature. We can also see the literature coming through in the biblical narrative from the homeland as well. Mm-hmm. And I think in a way it does bear witness to the understanding, I'll just use the word, the truth of where the early heritage came from. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. What you have is, they have the kernel of the element of creation and of the flood. They know that there was a flood. They know the basic elements of the story. They tell it in terms of their culture. So, for example, the next artifact we're going to look at is the Atrahasis epic, and the hero there is Zizudra. That's a Sumerian name for Noah, basically. He was a prehistoric ruler of the well-known city, and he is the individual that they describe in their cultural context. But the Bible speaks of him in terms of Noah, right? Because that was what was understood within the Hebrew culture. So we have the kernel of the truth there, and then they begin to describe it in terms of their cultural contexts from the different regions that they're in. And God, under inspiration, gives Moses and gives Joshua and gives the writers of the Old Testament the true description of what actually took place, and they write it in accordance to their traditions as well. The fact of the flood is a no-brainer for me because they have described it all over the place with many different tablets, and then we come to the Enuma Elish, which I actually had the privilege of going to the British Museum with my students. And behind me right here, this is the archive where they have all the tablets that have not been translated, and they're translating them. So there's even some tablets that haven't get translated yet. There's 130,000 in the British Museum alone that haven't been translated yet. But I got the opportunity to handle and look at the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish means when on high. Those are the first words of the text, and that's why they call it Enuma Elish. Same as we call Genesis, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first words of the ancient text. It was excavated in the library of Ashurbanipal in North Palace, Nineveh, Iraq, in 1889 by Hamuz Rassam under Henry Layard. There are 6 other copies discovered. The interesting thing is I showed them a photograph of the Enuma Elish that I wanted to look at. There's different tablets to it because it's broken in different pieces. The only piece they could find in the British Museum was the top half that I photographed and showed. I'll show a photograph of it. The bottom part of it they couldn't find in the British Museum. So the Enuma Elish has gone missing in the British Museum. I'm sure it's hidden under a chair somewhere, but I found that quite intriguing. They couldn't track down the Enuma Elish when I wanted to find it.
Hey, Doctor, we got a few minutes left here. We have to cover these other tablets later, but you went to the British Museum. You personally examined the Enuma Elish with your eyes and your hands. That's fantastic. But for the listening audience that haven't viewed our past podcast, you actually been to Mount Ararat. Since we're talking about the Ark.
Yeah, we were working with Ark Imaging. I was the operational manager or the organizational manager, and we were trying to do get our permits from the Turkish government in order to do a climb. I was going to do ground penetrating radar on the ice cap. I had some health issues and I wasn't able to climb to do that, but we did climb in the Ahura Gorge, where everybody says the Ark is possibly there. We didn't find any evidence of that. I'm not sure it has survived, but we did get our permits from working with Ataturk University in the capital with their archaeological department, and we did a ground survey of the region looking for pottery and brought some of that back and identified some of that for the university. I got detained there as well, which is kind of an interesting story.
You did tell me about you being detained. You look like a troublemaker. Man, if you was climbing on my mountain, I'd say, hey, buddy, what the heck are you doing on?
Yeah, they wanted our digital cameras. So It's always been amazing and a lot of fun to do it. You live the life of Indiana Jones in real life. It's kind of fun.
And come home and survive it and tell the story. That's the best part. This is fantastic. I appreciate your time all the way from Portugal. Once again, thank you for your time. I appreciate it immensely. This has been great. And to end it with your excursion to Mount Ararat is a fantastic way to end the podcast today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it. Good to be with you.